think sometimes you just look at someone and you think to yourself, yes. And I think in the case of my parents, when they looked at each other for the first time, they thought yes, and that was it. After that, they were the kind of people, a bit like I am, you sort of marry forever. When I got married 49 years ago, I thought to myself, yes, and I've never rethought it, and I think they were the same way. I'm Richard Ford. I'm a novelist, a short story writer, and essayist, and I've written a memoir of my parents, which is called Between Them. When I wrote the essay on my mother, which was finished in 1986, I almost immediately decided that I would write an essay about my father, both for reasons of just giving them their each due, but also because I miss my parents. I miss my parents every day, even though many years have passed since they've been gone from life. But because my father was a traveling salesman and was gone from life a lot, and because he died relatively early in my life when I was 16, to write about him was to address, in many instances, an absence from my life. So it took me really all these 30 years to collect information and to set down memories and to remember him and to think about him so as to make the premise that absence can be a presence plausible to myself, sufficient that I could write about him. I tried a couple of times to write the essay, and each time I just couldn't quite make it persuasive to myself until then one day, a year ago winter, I did. I said, okay, try it one more time. The piece about my mother, which I wrote in the 80s, was intact, and what I would have had to do was disassemble it in a way that I had no interest in doing. So to write two essays side by side was always what I wanted to do. People had said to me, why don't you merge these two into one narrative? But I thought I had a kind of working premise that I wanted to write about my parents as individuals, not just as a parental unit. I wanted to stress their full lives, which I saw. And because my mother and father were often in my presence separately, it's impossible to know what my parents would have made of this book because they were so far removed from it, both in time and in temperament. My father died when I was 16, and it isn't enough to say that the furthest thing from his mind was that his son would become a writer. It was unthinkable, unimaginable. In my mother's case, she did see me publish two books, and in each instance, I think she was slightly mystified by having a son who published two books. My mother was born in the far northwest corner of Arkansas in a house that didn't have a floor. So by the time I get around to 1968, which is 58 years later, it's really fairly far-fetched for her to think that her son could write a novel or two novels. But I did, and I gave them to her. One I dedicated to her, put them in her hand. She pretended to try to read them. She was a good reader, but not of the kind of books that I write. So I think she had a kind of a sort of liminal sense that here was her son who is a novelist. I don't think she knew what the consequences of those facts were. She just knew that I didn't have a job, and there was something weird about that. And there's an immense satisfaction in planning to do something for 30 years and then getting to do it, and to do it, in my view, properly. And then it was also very exhilarating. The language itself, which I found, was extremely exhilarating to discover. And then to be able to draw my parents close to me in a way that I know will last, both for the reader and for myself, was exhilarating. So there was almost no part of it other than the kind of melancholy which attends the contemplation of your parents who are no longer there. Other than that, it was almost entirely exhilarating, and remains so to this minute. When I go on TV and they put behind myself a big picture of my parents and me, first of all, it's a shock to see my parents on TV in the United Kingdom. But then I think to myself, well, good. I'm glad to see that. That's fitting in a way. That makes me happy. All of my parents' life when I was with them it remained the case that what was most important to them was between them. I was a part of things, but my whole sense of myself was that I was between the two of them. Sometimes separating them, sometimes as an allergic agent, sometimes as an intruder, but always third among the three of us. That their love for each other, which they shared with me and let me grow up in, was paramount. And I learned that somehow by writing about them.